Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this morning for our webinar on social value in public procurement. Lots of interest in this as clearly a topical issue. I am Shailee Howard. I'm a Principal Associate in the procurement team here at Mills Reeve. I spend my time advising contracting authorities and private sector companies on the procurement regulations. And as a firm, we act for lots of different contracting authorities, from central government departments to NHS trusts and universities, local authorities, other regulators, and non-departmental public bodies. And it's great to see such a range of our client base here today. And we also act for private sector bodies as well that work in the public sector delivering public contracts, and social value is very much an issue that applies to both authorities and to bidders. I'm joined by Jenny Beresford-Jones, who will also be talking today. Jenny is a professional support lawyer who specialises in procurement law. So we'll start with a bit of housekeeping. The session is being recorded and will be made available afterwards, along with the slides, so you can share it with your colleagues. You'll also see a Q&A box on your screen. Do use this to ask any questions and we'll endeavour to address them. And at the end, you will be asked to provide some feedback. So all comments are welcome. If there are any other topics that you'd like us to cover on procurement law, then do use that feedback form to let us know. So what are we going to talk about today? So we'll start with a brief reminder of the history of social value in procurement before talking about the PPN that was published last year that launched the social value model. And then we'll talk about some common issues that our clients are facing when applying the model in their procurements. So I'll hand over to Jenny for the first part.
Thanks, Shailee. Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here today, and thank you for joining us. Before we, drill down into the latest policy on social value that Shailee just mentioned, we thought it would be good to just cover a little bit of the background about how did we get here on social value, and perhaps look a bit about a bit at the history of it. So when I started out in public procurement, which I think was 6, if you went to a conference on public procurement, there was often a question around how far you could legitimately evaluate social value and environmental issues. And the concern at that time was generally around whether you could really say that these things could be linked to the most economically advantageous tender. And could you link a social value element to the subject matter of the contract? Could you say that it really properly had something to do with what the contract was all about? That all changed expressly when the Public Contracts Regulations 2015 were introduced, and we'll have a look at that shortly. But it's also just worth noting in terms of the background that even before we got the PCR 2015, we had already started to make a link in the statute books between social value and public procurement. And we had the introduction in 2012 of the Public Services Social Value Act and PPN 1012, which was the guidance around that. And so that act required authorities who were in scope to consider whether social value elements could be included in the procurement. And that was a duty which applied at the pre-procurement stage. And as the title of the act suggests, it's the Public Services Act, Social Value Act. So this applied just to services contracts. So we already have had something in statute, although probably quite a bit more limited than the latest policy that we're going to have a look at in this webinar. So I did mention that the 2015 regulations do pick out and expressly give permission to include social value issues. I'm not going to go through all of these. There's a couple of slides, this one and the next one, where we've picked out most of the regulations which cover social value issues. But particularly, I would draw out this ability, this discretionary ability to exclude candidates who breached social, environmental or labour law. And also, probably the key regulation is Regulation 67.2, which is generally around the drafting of award criteria. And that contains an express acknowledgement that award criteria can cover environmental and social aspects. The other thing we thought it would be useful just to highlight, so to touch on and direct you towards, were these two handbooks which have been issued by the government. There's the outsourcing playbook and then the construction playbook. And these are in essence two how-to guides, if you like, on how to run procurement in a best practice way. I've picked out on the two slides, this one here and the next, some of the key text included in those handbooks on social value. I'd leave you to have a look at those when the slides are circulated later. But as you can see, they are very alive to the usefulness of social value as a tool, for example, to address regional inequality, to develop employment opportunities and skills, to drive innovation, and to encourage a level playing field, particularly for smaller and medium-sized entities. So you can see that this policy on social value is sort of peppered throughout all these various bits of government policy and guidance. Before Shailee takes a look at some of the more tricky issues or discussion points that we have found coming up, we thought we would actually just have a bit of a focus on PPNO 620 itself. And as Shailee said, this was introduced in September of last year and came into force in January of this year. So that's the front page of the PPN, and there's a link to it there that you should be able to click on when you get the slides. I guess the first thing to draw out, just to draw to your attention, is that there are actually several parts or several elements to this PPN. So there's the actual guidance note itself, and then there's a social value model. There's a guide to using it, and also there's a quick reference table, which I guess is designed for you to be able to to print out and stick above your desk or whatever you would like to do with it. So the new policy in the PPN, I suppose the first thing it would be useful to do is to understand when it applies and who it actually applies to. So as I've said, it applies from the 1st of January this year. And in terms of the scope, it's mandatory guidance for central government, non-departmental public bodies, and executive agencies. But as with all of these government procurement policy notes, many other authorities, universities, NHS bodies, charities will often choose to follow it or follow parts of it as a matter of best practice. Unlike the Social Value Act, which applied only to services contracts, the guidance in the PPN actually applies to all types of contracts, with the exception, as I've noted there, of certain construction and capital investment in infrastructure projects over that £10 million threshold. And if it's one of those contracts that you're letting, then the guidance points you towards using PPN 0916 instead. I won't say any more about that here because that's quite specialised, but the general message is that leaving aside those contracts, PPNO applies to all types of public contract, with the exception, if you like, that you don't need to apply it if it's not relevant or proportionate to the subject matter of the contract to do so. And again, that immediately raises the question, which I think Shailee is going to try and bravely address shortly, of what does relevant and proportionate mean? And we'll come on to that shortly. So in terms of applying the PPN, what do you need to do? What does it say? What does it look like? Well, essentially, it requires you to use what's called the social value model. And this is quite a structured model which the government has drafted. And it's really based around 5 themes and policy outcomes related to each of those themes. So you can see the 5 themes there. There's COVID-19 recovery, fighting economic inequality, climate change, equal opportunities and well-being. And I won't go through all of these, but you can see under each of those, there's certain related policy outcomes. And in terms of then what you need to do with that social value model, the guidance says that you need to give in your award criteria a minimum of a 10% weighting to social value elements. And again, another sort of discussion point that we've had with clients, and that I think Shailee is going to try and pick up, is what does that 10% mean? Is it 10% of what? How fixed is it? We'll come on to that a bit later. So the social value model includes the major themes and the policy outcomes that we've just seen. And also the structure sort of drills down further into model questions, model award criteria, and model reporting metrics that the authorities can use. So I'm not going to go through this slide, but we thought it'd just be helpful to put this up here to just give you a sense of what the social value model looks like in real life, as it were, and what authorities might be expecting to be including in their evaluation methodology, and if you're a bidder, what you might expect to see if you're bidding for contracts where the authority is covered by the PPN. So you can see this is an example taken from theme 1, which is COVID-19 recovery, and the particular policy outcome is helping local communities to manage and recover from the impact of COVID-19. And you can see that under those, you've got a model evaluation question, which is essentially asking the tenderer to show how their tender is going to further this policy outcome. There are some model award criteria in relation to that and sub-criteria, and then there are the sort of reporting mechanism at the end, which is effectively, I guess, like a sort of key performance indicator for social value. You know, what does good look like? What does good delivery look like? So that just gives you a bit of a flavour of what the model looks like, and that's obviously repeated for all the themes and all the policy outcomes. That's what, if authorities do follow the social value model, that we might expect to see in ITTs going forward. So I think that brings us on to some of the discussion points, because obviously we've seen quite a lot of discussion and queries from clients about how you apply the PPN. And I think the first one we were going to look at, which might, I think, be linked to the second one there actually, is this question of what does relevant and proportionate mean? How do you make that assessment? I think, Shailee, are you able to say a bit about that?
Yes, so thanks, Jenny. So I think as Jenny's mentioned, there is reference in the model to choosing the objectives that are relevant and proportionate to your contract requirements. And so what the model doesn't anticipate is that you have to apply all of these outcomes all of the time. There needs to be an analysis of each of the policy outcomes to determine which ones are actually relevant to the contract that you're procuring and which ones aren't. And as Jenny says, there is a legal reason for this. So the regulations do say that award criteria should be linked to the subject matter of the contract. And suppose if you think about the rationale behind that, that makes absolute sense, that an authority should base a contract award decision on criteria that relate to the requirements and nothing else. And the model does actually give authorities quite a lot of guidance on this. So if you look at each of the policy outcomes, there is guidance on the circumstances where each of them may well be relevant and proportionate to the subject matter of the contract. So, for example, taking the outcome that Jenny was looking at just now, helping communities recover from the impact of the pandemic. This could be relevant if your contract, for example, includes a sector or relates to a sector where there's been a high rate of unemployment due to the pandemic, or there's been sort of skills gap due to the impact of the pandemic. So it's really sort of going through that thought process. We have seen some of our clients sort of struggle with this, and I think some bidders have been baffled too by some of the requirements that they've seen in tenders. Anecdotally, I heard of an authority that was looking for a professional services provider and requested apprenticeships, but actually the value of the apprenticeships that were being asked for was way in excess of the value of the contract. So I think in that scenario, I think there would be an argument that actually that requirement wasn't proportionate to the subject matter of the contract. I think what the model does anticipate, and I guess this is a thread through procurement law, is the importance of the audit trail, and making sure that as part of your pre-procurement exercise, that as an authority, you have really done that analysis about which ones are, which policy outcomes are relevant and which ones aren't. So, for example, one of our central government clients asked us to have a look at the report that they had produced that captured that thought process. And again, I think it's really important to incorporate that analysis into your pre-procurement planning, so that you've done all that thinking before you have launched your procurement.
Thanks, Shailee. I'm just having a look at the question of, can you include elements of the social value model as a sort of discretionary exclusion criteria at the selection stage? Is there any scope to do that?
I think the short answer to that is no. The social value model is designed to be applied at the tender stage, so not at that initial shortlisting stage when you are sort of sifting bidders to invite them later on to tender for the contract. And I think that makes sense. If you look at the detail of the model, is very much, it's all about sort of linking it to the contract requirements as opposed to looking at the capacity or capability of bidders. That's not to say that it's entirely out of the question, though. I think, as you mentioned earlier, breach of certain social laws is a discretionary ground for exclusion, which would be applied at that selection stage. And it may well be possible to include it as a sort of a question around technical and professional ability, provided that you're not sort of duplicating the specific criterion at both the selection and the award stage. But I think the sort of key message is this model is very much for application at that tender stage.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the 10% rating, I know that I've seen people asking, what does that mean? Is it 10% of what? How strict is it?
Yeah.
Do you have anything?
So yes, it is 10% of the overall weighting. So, for example, you'd have quality at, 50%, price at 40%, and then social value at 10%. And I guess that's a deliberate move on the part of the government, because the idea is that social value offerings really do have an impact on who wins the bid. So I guess that's sort of the default rule. The only permissible exception to that is where actually you've done some pre-market engagement, and as a result of that, it's clear that actually to use sort of 10% of the overall weighting would reduce competition because there just isn't enough of a mature market in delivering social value. So I think in those cases, you might be able to specify social value as 10% of the quality score. It's not to say that you can sort of do away with it entirely, but you can sort of assume it within your quality weighting instead. And the model actually also says the reverse as well. So actually, if you have a very mature market in delivering social value, then it is open to an authority to apply a weighting that's higher than 10% of the weight of the overall weighting. But again, sort of thinking about things like proportionality is really important there. And I think what is clear is that, again, sort of part of that pre-procurement planning and pre-market engagement, again, the weighting might be something that you consider before you launch your procurement.
And in terms of, I mean, obviously the model is very structured and sort of drills down to several levels. Do you have to apply all of that in full, or can you tailor it or amend it or pick and choose? How does that come out?
But I think, yes, absolutely. The expectation is that you do sort of pick and choose depending on what is relevant to your contract. But and you can add, the guide says that you can add to the outcomes in the social value model, but you can't change the ones that are already there. So, for example, you might want to add to your outcomes if actually, because of your own department's sort of strategy and objectives, there's something else that you would like to meaningfully evaluate. And in that case, then the guidance says that you ought to mirror the sort of the approach and style that's used in the model. And that's to make sure that there's a consistent message to your bidders. You might find that actually, if you look through the social value model, none of the policy outcomes apply. Struggling to think of a scenario when that actually might be, but if that is the case, then again, you might, in those circumstances, you'd have some flexibility to design additional policy outcomes. I guess that's all the case if you are an in-scope organisation, but if you're not and you're looking at the model sort of as best practice, I think you would have sort of more flexibility, but I think it would still be a good idea to sort of mirror the approach and style, just because your bidding community will be familiar with it.
And in terms of frameworks and DPSs, is there anything sort of particular to think about in terms of those in this context?
Yeah, so the guide to the framework, the guide to the social value model does address this. So with a framework agreement, you can indeed, when you're setting up that framework agreement, apply the social value model, and you can include the model, some of the questions in the call-off stage as well. What you can't do is apply the social value model at the call-off stage if it wasn't part of the criteria for the framework agreement. So I guess it all starts from sort of the framework agreement competition at the top. If you are directly awarding a contract under a framework agreement, then what the guidance to the model says is that the suppliers that have been awarded the framework agreement will be bound by a commitment to deliver whatever social value they sort of proposed as part of their bid to get onto the framework. I know there's another question around sort of contractualizing elements later, but if there is a direct award, then those proposals that were put in at the framework level would then form part of that sort of the competition, the contract at the sort of the secondary call-off level. With a dynamic purchasing system, so they differ, I suppose, from framework agreements because suppliers can join the DPS at any point, and full tenders are submitted at a later date, and you have that sort of the detailed tendering exercise at that secondary stage. So there, the model does say that you could potentially evaluate social value as part of that initial stage to win a place on the DPS. But again, if you're undertaking a call for competition, then you apply the social value model in the usual way at that sort of secondary stage.
And in terms of the contracts, I know we've had queries about what do we put in our contracts around social value?
Yeah.
Some sort of KPI type deliverables, are they appropriate?
Yes, yeah, I think that's right, and I think that a lot of work has clearly gone into the model to make sure that the that proposals are sort of measurable, I suppose. So there's sort of the reporting metrics column of the model, which I think is quite useful in being able to really quantify what proposals mean. So, for example, number of full-time employees or that sort of thing. And I think what authorities ought to do is incorporate the proposals from the winning tenderer's bid into the contract. So using those reporting metrics. And those in turn will sort of become the key performance indicators, which, as I say, should be something that's quantifiable and measurable, and then that can be sort of monitored during the life of the contract in the usual way. And I know that there's guidance available on contracts and contract management and incorporating KPIs as well. That's referred to in the outsourcing playbook too. So worth a look at that. And I think taking the same approach with social value is recommended.
And in terms of, I know often at selection stage, you make an assessment of the tender's corporate social responsibility statements. Does that have any place here, or is that much more of a selection stage issue?
Yeah, I think that's right, Jenny. And I think corporate social responsibility is sort of aligned, but really refers to how an organisation performs corporately. It's a lot more general. It's not contract specific, and therefore isn't sort of designed to meaningfully evaluate social value in the same way as the sort of model anticipates. So I suppose if you put one of these questions into your tender documents and you get back a whole load of sort of sales stuff that's come from a website, then that's not sort of what's anticipated by the model at all.
And in terms of SMEs, how does that apply where you perhaps got a less mature market? Sort of a tailoring to do there.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think the PPN does apply to SMEs. So if your contract is covered by the PPN, then you're under an obligation to apply it. Suppose it's part of that sort of thinking about what's relevant and proportionate. You might sort of tailor your social value requirements accordingly. And I think, as we said earlier, around the sort of 10% weighting, think about whether your market really is mature enough to deliver sort of a significant social value offering. So if you have got a large proportion of SMEs, for example, that could be something that factors into that decision to change the 10% weighting. And I guess it's also worth mentioning that, sort of as a side point, if you've got a below threshold contract, then PPN 11 says that you can reserve procurements for SMEs, so not an above threshold contract to which the social value model would apply, but if you've got a below threshold contract to which the procurement rules don't apply, but you're still running some sort of competition for it, then you are able to limit that to just SMEs.
And in terms of the sort of audit trail, I guess really it's sort of with everything in procurement, you need to keep an audit trail, and I suppose this is no different really.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think, as you said before, really thinking about that pre-procurement planning stage and incorporating social value into that process. And then as you sort of go through the procurement, I think, recording how you've evaluated social value in the usual way. And I think that all sort of would end up in your Regulation 84 report that sort of tells the story of your procurement.
And just before we finish, did you want to say, I think you were going to say just a little bit on future directions?
Yes, I think we're just on time. So I think we've had a couple of questions on the green paper too. So you might be aware that the government has published a green paper which sets out proposals for the reform of procurement law. That was published in December, and that was out for consultation until March. So responses are in. I think the government's received over 600 responses. So clearly a lot to say, a lot of thoughts on the proposals. But social value is very much part of that, part of those proposals. So it's clear from the green paper that any new legislation will provide for the evaluation of social value, as you can see from the quote on the slide. And a new national procurement policy statement is also proposed. So contracting authorities will be under an obligation to consider sort of national priorities that will be set out in the statement when you're complying with the procurement rules, and social value is very much part of that, or is anticipated to be part of that. So we will wait to see what any resultant legislation looks like, but I think it's safe to say that social value will feature heavily.
So I suppose really that sort of brings us to the end. Shailee, did you just want to say something a little bit about our procurement portal?
Yes. Just a shameless plug really for our procurement portal. So the link's there on the slide. It's a free resource. There's lots on there, all about sort of whether your procurement is covered, what processes might look like, sort of issues that you might come across. There's the standstill period calculator, which apparently is one of the most visited Mills and Reeves websites across all the M&R websites, which I think we should be proud of as a team. And there's also a blog as well. So that blog is kept up to date with updates. This is an area that's sort of changing all the time, and the government's issuing guidance all the time. So well worth signing up for alerts on that. So I think we've managed to go just only slightly over, but thanks very much all, and look forward to seeing you again soon.